Evaluation and Research Small Business and Industry Assistance Program, also known as CDER SBIA. Thank you for joining us today for our presentation on recent updates made to FDA's Study Data Technical Conformance Guide version 4.4, posted in October 2019. The Study Data TGC version 4.4 provides specifications, recommendations, and general considerations on how to submit standardized study data using FDA-supported data standards located in the FDA Standards Catalog. The webinar will be posted in its entirety, both video and audio, on our website within 5 business days, and that website is fda.gov/CDER SBIA webinars. Before we begin, I'd like to cover some details. Slides for today's presentation are available from the right-hand side of your screen where the orange button says Download the Presentation. This activity is eligible for continuing education by SOCRA, RAPS, SQA, and ACRP. Please refer to our website at fda.gov/CDER SBIA for more details. You'll be able to obtain the attendance certificate only upon completion of the survey, which will remain open for 2 weeks. That means it closes on December 6th. Even if you don't need the certificate, we would appreciate it if you let us know your comments and feedback via the survey. To outline today's event, the webinar in its entirety will run approximately 1.5 hours, which includes a Q&A session. Our speakers today are Helena Sviglin, Study Data Technical Conformance Guide Chair, Office of Strategic Programs, CDER; Heather Crandall, Electronic Submissions Team, Office of Business Informatics, CDER; and Stephanie Leuenroth-Quinn, Non-Clinical Representative for Data Standards Development, Office of New Drugs, CDER. Welcome, Helena.
Thank you, Ray, and welcome everyone today to our webinar. As you guys know, we put out the Study Data Technical Conformance Guide. It's a collaborative effort across CBER and CDER, and we put it out twice a year in March and October, and occasionally we put out a special edition, and we put out our October edition in 2019, and we're here to talk to you about it today. So the topics covered in this webinar, we'll have 3 of them. The first one is a presentation by Heather Crandall. She'll go over the Study Data Technical Rejection Criteria, also referred to as TRC. We've worked very closely with our colleagues over in OBI to develop technical rejection criteria that dovetail into all of the other technical advice given in the Study Data Technical Conformance Guide. It's been an iterative process, and we have updates in this edition of the Technical Conformance Guide, so we're here today to talk to you about them. The second topic, even though it says that's the other first topic, is going to be given today by Stephanie Leuenroth-Quinn, and she's in CDER in the Office of New Drugs, and she's going to talk to you today about how to use the new Simplified trial summary XPT for non-clinical submissions. We put a lot of new content refining how to use this and how to populate the fields in this and how to generate one for yourself easily. And we put details on that into this TCG, and Stephanie will talk to you about it today. And then afterwards, we'll come back and have a demo of the online technical rejection criteria worksheet. This is a free worksheet provided by the agency. It's online. You guys can, it's interactive. You guys can fill it in. We don't save or store any of that data. It's simply an aid to help you understand the submission process better. We don't expect you to submit this worksheet, and you guys are going to get a sneak peek because this one hasn't even been fully published yet. So it's your treat for being our guest today on this webinar. So every edition of the Technical Conformance Guide, we summarize all of the editions. We have that here. And today, just so you guys can follow along, all of our updates are going to be primarily covered in these major updates. The major updates we're covering today are covered in these sections of our update. Here's a screenshot of the technical conformance guide. If you guys have any questions, as always, anyone in industry or in the other regulatory agencies, they can submit questions. We do a really good job of getting timely answers to you guys, and here's the information about that, and we'll repeat this throughout the presentation. So we have our first presenter today. Heather, welcome.
Hi, thanks. So I'm Heather Crandall. I work in the Office of Business Informatics in CDER, and I'm here today to talk about the technical rejection criteria for study data revisions in October 2019. So skip to. This is a brief overview of the history and background of the study data technical rejection criteria documentation, or TRC for short. So the TRC is coming from the study data guidance, which was published in December of 2014. And in that guidance, it states that studies submitted in NDAs, BLAs, and ANDAs that have a study start date after December 17th, 2016, and studies submitted in commercial INDs that have a study start date after December 17th, 2017, those studies must conform to standards in the FDA Data Standards Catalog. So the TRC documentation was actually updated twice in 2019, once in January, and there's a brief overview of what those revisions were on this slide, and then again in October. And today I'm going to focus on the October revisions. So to recap and kind of go over the technical rejection criteria validations, there are 4 of them listed in the TRC documentation. The first one is 1734, which states a data set named ts.xpt, or a trial summary data set, with information on study start date must be present for each study in required sections. And what that required sections means is that if you look in the TRC documentation, the TRC does not apply to every subsection of Module 4 and Module 5. It only applies to specific subsections, and those are listed out in the TRC documentation. So that's what the required sections is referring to. For 1735, that validation states the correct STF file tags must be used for all standardized data sets and corresponding define.xml files in required sections. And what those file tags are listed both in the validation, in the documentation, and also I'll get into more of that later in the live demo. For 1736, that is looking for DM datasets, ADSL datasets, and define.xml files in the required sections, depending on if you are submitting a SEND dataset, an SDTM dataset, or an ATOM dataset. And again, we'll get into more of this with that live demo of the worksheet at the end. And finally, validation 1789, which is actually coming out of the ECTD guidance. And that validation states that study files must be referenced in a study tagging file. And for 1789, study files is referring to not just the data sets, but also PDF files, or if you are submitting an image with your study, that must also be referenced in a study tagging file. And the required sections for 1789 are different than the ones for 1734, 35, and 36, so those are listed here. So getting into the October 2019 revisions for the TRC. There are a couple revisions that I'm going to go through today, and the first one is that in the second appendix in the documentation, we give several examples of the simplified TS file for clinical versus non-clinical, and whether or not a valid study start date is being included. And those examples have been updated with this revision to call out the use of the value NA in the TS.val.nf file in alignment with the Study Data Technical Conformance Guide updates. And in the next part of this webinar with Stephanie's presentation, she will go over more of the details on when to use that NA value. The other revision for the October 2019 release is previously the TRC documentation used to state the ts.xpt and STF need to contain matching study ID values. And with this October revision, it now states the ts.xpt needs to contain either a study ID or sponsor reference ID value that matches with the STF study ID. So a little bit of background on this revision. This revision is actually coming from feedback from industry, which pointed out several scenarios where a ts.xpt study ID may not be able to be matched with the STF study ID. For example, when a study is bought by another company and the study ID is already established. So with these scenarios in this feedback, there was the proposed solution of the inclusion of the sponsor reference ID parameter inside the ts.xpt file as an alternate path to match with the STF study ID. So FDA did some analysis based on this feedback and this proposed solution. And we looked at about 4,600 studies from the submissions we are currently receiving. So it's important to keep in mind that the technical rejection criteria for study data has not yet been implemented. So we were doing this analysis just based on studies that we are currently receiving. So we looked at about 4,600 studies, and I see a typo in this line. We actually looked at clinical and non-clinical studies, so not just the non-clinical ones in our evaluation. And within those 4,600 studies, about 75% of the ones that we analyzed had a study ID in the ts.xpt file match with the STF study ID. So then we looked at these studies where that match did not occur, and we narrowed that down to the ones that already contained an SP-ref ID parameter in them. And of that subset, about 6% of the studies had a match between the SP-ref ID and the STF study ID. Also, based on this, we saw the largest increase in the potential pass rate for these studies for non-clinical NDA and commercial IND studies, because keep in mind, this match is occurring as part of the 1734 validation before it checks the study start date. So with this alternate possible match through the SP-ref ID, the pass rate, at least for these two NDA and commercial IND non-clinical, increases by about 17%. So I wanted to dig in a little deeper to the analysis and show some of the data here. So like I said, we looked at about 4,600 studies in clinical and non-clinical, and we looked at them only in the TRC applicable sections, so those required sections from 1734, 35, and 36. And when we only looked at the match between the TS study ID and the STF study ID, Across all of those application types of ANDA, BLA, NDA, and commercial IND, there was a pass rate of about 75%. Sorry, I misread that. 75% was the potential pass rate. So remember, the 1734 is not yet implemented, so this is simply based on our analysis. And for non-clinical specifically, we saw a potential pass rate of about 68%. However, when we included the alternate match of the SP-Ref ID with the STF study ID, the overall potential pass rate for 1734 went up to about 81%, with, you can see, the highest increase being in those M4 sections for NDAs and commercial INDs. So based on this analysis, we added an example to our first appendix of the TRC documentation highlighting this scenario where the SP-Ref ID provides the matching study ID to the STF. And this SP-Ref ID additional parameter allows sponsors to use an alternate path to provide a matching study ID to the STF study ID, potentially increasing the pass rate for 1734 according to our analysis. So if you have any questions about study data, you can contact eData, and if you have any questions about the STF or file tags, please contact eSub, and I will pass this over to Stephanie.
Thank you, Heather. I am Stephanie Leuenroth-Quinn, and I'm a pharmacologist in the Office of New Drugs within the immediate office. So today I'm going to give you the non-clinical perspective on the technical rejection criteria and SEND compliance. I'm also going to talk about non-clinical considerations for the technical rejection criteria. And finally, I will give you some examples of how to use the simplified ts.xpt file. So to begin with, what I really want to state is that SEND has value to O&D non-clinical reviewers. These data sets will facilitate the review of non-clinical study reports. It gives reviewers the ability to really focus in on findings of interest and the ability to export data into review templates, such as tables and graphs. SEND also allows us to examine individual animal study parameters without literally scrolling through hundreds, if not thousands, of pages of data in PDF format. And certainly in the future, this will allow for data mining initiatives and cross-study analyses. So why we're here today is to talk about the new information in the Study Data Technical Conformance Guide. It has been updated to provide additional information on the technical rejection criteria and the non-clinical use of the simplified ts.xpt. There are instructions in the TCG to explain when and how to use the simplified ts.xpt for non-clinical submissions. And I've included the link to the Study Data TCG on this slide for your reference. So first, let's begin with the non-clinical purpose for the technical rejection criteria. This centers around SEND compliance. So first, what we need to do is establish what is the study type, and that is based on what module the study is submitted to, as well as the file tag, and when did that study start. Now that's based on the ts.xpt file, either the simplified or full, which is what I'll be talking about today. And we need this information in a machine-readable format. Once we have that, we can determine, does that non-clinical study report require SEND, or is a simplified TS included that would indicate SEND is not required. When we have all of this information, then the submission can proceed through the electronic gateway and be processed for reviewer assignment. So as Heather stated, the technical rejection criteria is an automated validation process. It will be added to the existing ECTD validation criteria to enforce compliance with SEND requirements for study types modeled in an FDA-supported SEND implementation guide. So importantly, when the technical rejection criteria becomes active, for non-clinical studies, it will only apply to ECTD modules 4.2.3.1, single dose toxicity, 4.2.3.2, repeat dose toxicity, and 4.2.3.4, or carcinogenicity. So before I move forward telling you more about the simplified TS, what I want to do is give an explanation about the non-clinical considerations for the technical rejection criteria. So I want to give you the landscape of the different types of studies that may be submitted to the agency in certain folder structures. So in the example on the screen, I'm simply pointing at 4.2.3.2, or repeat dose toxicity. So let's say, for example, you have a 1-month rat toxicity study, and that study requires SEND based on the study initiation date. But in addition to that, let's say you have another traditional toxicity study that's conducted, a 6-month chronic rat study. And because that was initiated back in 2014, that doesn't require SEND. So how do we differentiate between those two different types of studies? But to make matters more complicated, there are other reports that are coming into the same folder structure. Those could include such things as a veterinarian report on certain cardiovascular findings that reference a study that has been previously completed. Or perhaps there is a multiple dose exploratory rat study that has been completed. These studies are usually very short in duration. They have limited number of animals. They're conducted early in development, and those wouldn't require SEND. They're traditionally summarized in text format, and there's very little information. Or perhaps there's a draft study protocol. So for example, perhaps the agency and a sponsor are having a discussion about their study protocol for a proposed 9-month dog toxicity study. That's a protocol. It's a text-based document, but it's submitted into the repeat dose toxicity module. So how do we account for all of these different types of reports that are being submitted in the same space where one would expect SEND data sets to be submitted? So now let's walk through an example so I can really define what we're talking about here with the technical rejection criteria and non-clinical submissions. So let's say you have a brand new IND, and again, we're only concerned here with the non-clinical studies, and there may be a variety of different pharmacology studies that are submitted to Module 4.2.1, and then there may also be studies submitted to Module 4.2.2, or pharmacokinetics. And then there's a whole variety of different toxicology studies submitted into Module 4.2.3. Well, for now, when the technical rejection criteria becomes active, we're not going to worry immediately about those pharmacology studies. We're not concerned with 4.2.2 and pharmacokinetic studies. What we are concerned with are those studies that fall within the toxicology module, but not all of them. So only modules 4.2.3.1, 4.2.3.2, and 4.2.3.4 will apply to the technical rejection criteria. So let's now walk through a few examples of different types of non-clinical reports that could be submitted to one of these folders. So let's take the example where you have a single-dose rat toxicity study that was initiated in December of 2018. By the study initiation date alone and the module it's submitted into, one would expect that that would require SEND. However, what if we consider the case where there's no endpoint modeled in SEND? Let's say this is a specialized endpoint. This happens. What do we do with those types of studies? Moving on to the repeat dose toxicity module, let's say you have your 28-day draft rat toxicity study initiated in 2018. That one's simple. That requires SEND. It's a standard study. But in addition to that, there's also a 14-day rat toxicity study submitted, and that was initiated in 2016. So that would not require send. So how do we know that if we don't have a machine-readable format of the study initiation date? And finally, we could also get the example of the expert pathologist report that's submitted, for example, for a 3-month dog study. This is a text-based document and does not have a study initiation date. And finally, let's take the example of the carcinogenicity module. One could submit a rodent carcinogenicity risk assessment document. Again, this is a text-based document, does not have a study initiation date. So how do we handle that? So I've been talking a lot about the different modules that apply for non-clinical reports. And we're going to continue with this example of the repeat dose toxicity module 4232. So let's walk through a few examples. In addition to the module, we're also looking at the study tagging file. In the example of the 28-day rat toxicity study initiated in 2018, and that requires send, the file tag could be study report body. But that 14-day rat toxicity study initiated in 2016 does not require send, also could use the same study tagging file of study report body. And to complicate issues even more, now if you have this text-based document, it could also use the study tagging file of study report body. The point being is that there are a limited number of ICH-specified file tags, and the majority of these reports that are coming into the agency are using one of these 3 listed on the screen. All 3 of these, preclinical study report, legacy clinical study report, and study report body, will trigger the technical rejection criteria. So what are we missing? We're missing the study initiation date. So as I stated, we're looking at the study tagging file, and certainly we're pulling information from this, such as the study ID and the file tag. But what the study tagging file does not have is a study initiation date. So that's where the simplified ts.xpt file comes in. So remember, the goal here is to ensure send compliance based on study type and study initiation date. So the simplified TS will allow us to identify studies that were initiated before the implementation date, or it will also indicate if a study report doesn't have a study start date. And again, the simplified TS is explained in the Study Data TCG. So to be clear, I just want to compare the full and simplified ts.xpt files. The full TS will accompany send datasets. It follows published CDISC standards, while the simplified ts.xpt is to be used when send datasets are not required for submissions in modules 4231, 4232, or 4234, and when one of these 3 file tags are used. So to put these in general categories, just as a reminder, if we simply look at the study initiation date, and this example I'm using for INDs, but just as a reminder, send also applies to NDAs and BLAs with a different study initiation date, December 17th, 2016. But for this example, if the study initiation date for commercial INDs is after December 17th, 2017, and you're submitting to one of these 3 modules, send is required and a full TS is required. If that study initiation date is before or on December 17th, 2017 for commercial INDs, a simplified ts.xpt file is required. If the study initiation date is not applicable and you're submitting to one of these 3 modules, again, a simplified TS is needed. So you may be wondering, what exactly do I mean by when the study initiation date is not applicable? So within the Study Data TCG, under section 8.2.2, we give further definition and examples for this, and I've reproduced that on the next couple of slides. So just to walk through a couple of these examples, what I mean are certain documents that could be primarily text-based documents, such as expert pathologist report or a veterinarian report, or if a non-clinical safety report is submitted into one of these modules. Carcinogenicity protocol amendments or carcinogenicity risk assessments could be included here. And I just want to spend a moment on exploratory or tolerability toxicology study summaries. So what we mean by this are these types of studies that use limited numbers of animals, limited numbers of endpoints. It's usually summarized, and it's usually conducted early on in development. Those types of small studies would not require SEND, and a simplified TS could be used. A few other examples are listed on this slide, but just to let you know, again, if the study type is not currently modeled in an applicable SEND-IG, or there's specialized tox studies conducted where there are no study parameters modeled in an applicable SEND-IG, then again, a simplified TS could be used. So how do you create one of these simplified ts.xpt files? So in the first example, let's first look at when a valid study initiation date is available, and the study is modeled in an FDA-supported SEND-IG. So again, let's take our example of the 14-day rat toxicity study initiated in 2016, and the file tag is preclinical study report. The information that would be needed is minimal. You would need the study ID that matches the file tag. You would need the correct TS PARM code, and you would need the study initiation date, and that's it. In the next example, what about when the study initiation date is not applicable? So again, this primarily would be text-based documents with no tabulated data or line listings. So again, let's use the example of the expert pathologist report, and the file tag used is study report body. What information would be needed? Again, you would need the study ID to match the study tagging file ID. You would need the correct TS PARM code, and in this case, you would need to fill in the field TS val and F with NA or not applicable. And again, that's all the information we need. So let's walk through a few different non-clinical submission scenarios regarding the technical rejection criteria. So in the example where one would have a 30-day rat toxicity study that was initiated in 2018, it's being submitted to Module 4232. The file tag is preclinical study report, and a full TS and SEND datasets are submitted that will absolutely pass the technical rejection criteria. If you take that same exact example and no TS is provided, or a simplified TS is provided using the study start date of June 22nd, 2018, the answer is that will not pass the technical rejection criteria because SEND would be required. In the next example, if you have a 3-month mouse toxicity study initiated back in 2016, submitted to 4232, preclinical study report tag, if a simplified TS is used using the correct study start date of 3/18/2016, yes, that will pass the technical rejection criteria. And finally, let's go back to the example of that draft protocol for a 9-month dog toxicity study. This is a protocol, but it's submitted to Module 4232. But in this case, the file tag that's used is protocol or amendment. So that is correct use of that particular file tag. In that case, the technical rejection criteria will read that tag and it will stop. A ts.xpt file is not needed, and it will pass the technical rejection criteria. So the big picture, what do sponsors need to consider for the technical rejection criteria? So in other words, the non-clinical considerations. So the big question is, what is in that submission? Is the study type modeled in an FDA-supported SEND-IG and supported in the current FDA Data Standards Catalog? Does the study have endpoints modeled in SEND, what is the study initiation date, and what is that submission? For example, is it a text-based document? The next thing to consider would be what is the best study tagging file to use. So if one of these three study tags are used, then that will trigger the technical rejection criteria. There are other file tags, and if they're used appropriately, such as for non-clinical safety reports or non-clinical protocol submissions, that will pass the technical rejection criteria, or if there's any doubt, simply use a simplified ts.xpt file. And finally, what module are you submitting these studies into? So again, when activated, the technical rejection criteria will check non-clinical studies submitted into modules 4.2.3.1, 3.2, and 3.4. And as a final word, I just wanted to state that we recommend that the Study Data Standardization Plan, or SDSP, should be used during development to communicate the intent to submit SEND datasets. The SDSP can be updated so that all historical, current, and planned use of study data standards is included. When appropriate, the SDSP may also be used to further explain the intended use of the simplified ts.xpt files. And importantly, use of the SDSP will allow for identification of potential data standardization issues in a timely manner, and that could be discussed with the review division if needed before you're ever submitting these studies. So in summary, I hope that I have demonstrated that SEND datasets will facilitate the review of non-clinical study reports, so this has value to us. The technical rejection criteria will ensure SEND compliance using an automated validation process. And the simplified ts.xpt file will provide additional machine-readable information when SEND is not required, such as for the study start date. I've listed further information and links on the Study Data TCG, the TRC, ECTD, as well as the Standardized Study Data Guidance. And certainly, if there are any questions, please submit them to the Q&A pod, and for future questions, please submit to one of these two email addresses. So that is the end of my presentation, and now I will turn this back over to Heather.
Hi. So I wanted to talk a little bit about general tools for industry regarding the TRC before we get into the live demo. So available on the FDA webpage are several tools and resources to help sponsors meet the study data standard requirements and provide more transparency on the TRC validation. So one of the new resources posted to the webpage is the Simplified TS File Creation Guide. And this is a PDF that walks through how to create a simplified TS file using free and open source software in both R and Python. So this is available on the webpage to look through and use to generate a simplified TS file. So with that, I'm going to get into the live demo of the latest version of the self-check worksheets. This is version 3.0. As Helena mentioned earlier, this is a sneak peek. This version of the self-check worksheet is has been updated to align with the TRC and TCG updates for October, and will be posted to the web shortly. So, the self-check worksheet is a fillable form that was put out sorry, I lost my thought there, was created and put out on the web following feedback from industry to help walk through the expectations for CDER and SBIA with the technical rejection criteria validation. So there is no expectation that this fillable form, the self-check worksheet, would be submitted with your study. This is simply for sponsors' reference. They can fill this out before they submit and kind of check their submission before it gets sent in. So I'm actually going to go through two different scenarios today to show the full self-check worksheet. So the first section is the general application and submission information. So I'm going to say we're submitting to CDER, a commercial IND, and then make up an application number for this. So we'll say 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And this is our first sequence, so it's sequence 0. The self-check worksheet is actually designed based on this being the first time a study is being submitted. So it doesn't have to be the first sequence that it's being submitted in. It could be a later sequence, but it's designed around this being the first time the study is submitted. That doesn't mean that it might not be helpful for people to use it if they have submitted part of the study previously, but it is designed based on this being the first time. So then we get into section 2, and I'm not going to fill out every section in here. I'm just going to skip through some of them to show you. So we get into section 2, and sections 2 through 5 are actually for the study itself. So if you're submitting multiple studies, you can actually have additional sections 2 through 5 populate at the end of the worksheet. So I'm going to say our study ID is ABC123. And yes, this is the first time it's being submitted. And our study title. And then our study section. So I'm going to say that we are submitting in module 2. This is non-clinical, 4232. We're submitting non-clinical, and because this is a fillable form, there's actually logic built in to some of these questions. So when we click non-clinical, analysis grayed out because there would not be an expectation of analysis data sets being submitted into module 4. So I'll say we're submitting tabulation, send data. And with this logic, these answers here will actually determine some of the questions, especially for section 5, that get populated later. Oh, let me close that out. So then we move on to section 3, which covers 1789. So we'll say that yes, they're being submitted into a study section of module 4. Yes, an STF file is included, and all of our files are referenced in it, which is 1789. Then we fill out the study ID in our STF, which we'll say is ABC123. And the logic automatically checks that against field 2A and says that yes, it matches it. So if I instead wrote ABC124, it would say no, it does not match. So let me put that back. And then in this example, I'll say that for this send data set, we are not submitting XPT files, but we are submitting a study file tagged with one of these 3. So then we move on to section 4, which covers 1734. And because we said we are submitting a commercial IND, we would answer question 4A, and 4B, which covers NDAs, BLAs, and ANDAs, is grayed out. So I'm going to say that we're submitting prior to that guidance date of December 17th. And then below this is a table which you can tell based on your study start date, application type, data type, and study section what the expectation is for CDER and SBIA for submitting a TS file. This is actually a pared down version of the table that is on the TRC documentation. So if you would like to see more details, they can be found there. So in this case, we said we are submitting a commercial IND with non-clinical data prior to December 17th and in 4232, so a simplified TS should be submitted. So we'll scroll down then and say yes, a TS file is required, and we did include it, and it's a simplified. So based on simplified, this section populated. Had I set a full TS, a different section would populate, and I'll actually go through that in the second walkthrough. So for the simplified here, we'll say our study ID is ABC123, and again, there's logic checking. So if I had typed in 124, it would say no, but we're going to say we do match. And then it asks about the TS val NF field. And in this case, I'm going to say no. You could mark them off as yes, but for this example, I'm going to say no. And then our study start date. And for this, since it's prior to that date, our study start date is January 1st of 2012, and it is in the valid format of year, month, and date. And this walks us through 1734. So based on, then we get into section 5, which covers 1735 and 1736. And the first question is, are standardized data sets required? And you can use this table to say based on the study start date, the application type, is it required? So based on what I filled out, they're not required. And then you could finish the self-check worksheet. However, just to show you some of the functionality here, I'm going to say that they are. And then section 5 populates questions based on the fact that we said we're submitting a SEND data set in non-clinical. So it's asking specific questions for 1735 and 36 based on this SEND dataset expectation. So it's asking if a DM file is included, if a define file is included, and then are the file tags that are specified in 1735 for standardized tabulation datasets and define files, are they used? So that is the first walkthrough, and then I will go through the second, and a lot of it will be the same, but I'll just show you some of the other functionality based on a different scenario. So I'm going to go through, and we'll still say CDER, but now we'll say an NDA. Our application will be 919192. Still the same sequence number, same study ID, long study title. And because in this case, I'll say we're doing a clinical study, so we're going to submit this to section 5.3.1.2. And we're going to say clinical and submitting tabulation and analysis. So this will change our section 5 questions. We are still submitting in a study section with an STF. Our study ID is still 123. It matches. We are submitting XPT data sets, but now 3G, question 3G is grayed out because that is only applicable to non-clinical sections. And because we're submitting in clinical, this is grayed out. And also we would answer 4B because we are answering about an NDA this time, not a commercial IND. So in this case, I'll say it's after that required date in the guidance. And again, checking this table, in this case we said after December 16th, we are in an NDA in clinical in one of these sections, so a full TS is required. So again, yes, yes, and full. So now it populates questions based on the expectation of a full TS. So in this case, we would fill out the study ID in the TS, but I want to show you how this works if our study ID in our TS does not match the study ID in the STF. So now it does not match, and we can fill out what the study ID is in the SPREF ID parameter instead, and say that that is ABC123. And the logic says this does match the STF study ID. We said our study start date was after that, so I'm going to say it's January 1st of 2019, and that is in the valid year, month, day format. So based on this table of after NDA, it is required, and now Section 5 populates to answer validation 1735 and 1736. So for the SDTM data set, did you include a DM and a define file? And there's a note here saying if you answered no, validation rule 1736 would fail based on that answer. And then are your STF file tags for your SDTM data sets, data tabulation dataset SDTM? We'll say yes. Similarly for the define file, data tabulation, data definition, these are the file tags that are indicated in the 1735 validation when you read those details in the TRC documentation. You can find them there. And similarly, because we said we're also submitting analysis for the ATOM dataset, is an ADSL file included, is a define file, and the file tags. So, and you have all these notes here about answering no. And then if you wanted to add an additional study, you would just click here, and it would populate another section 2 through 5. So that is the walkthrough of the self-check worksheet, and that's all for our presentation and demo. We're going to take a brief break and be back in a few minutes to answer some questions.
Hi, we're back. This is Stephanie, and there are a few questions that seem to be recurring themes that I wanted to address. So the first of these questions is around the requirement for SEND with GLP or non-GLP studies. So I understand there's quite a bit of confusion around this, but I want to state that in general, both GLP and non-GLP studies would require SEND. Now let me clarify that a little bit. There may be subsets of certain There may be subsets of certain non-GLP studies, such as that I talked about, these exploratory or tolerability studies, that would not require SEND. The issue talking around quote-unquote non-GLP studies is that that doesn't mean one thing. There's a whole different variety of study types that come in as non-GLP. So again, non-GLP and GLP studies in general will require SEND, but please realize there may be subsets of non-GLP studies that would not require SEND. And the one class of examples that I've listed that's in the TCG is for those type of exploratory or tolerability studies where there's minimal information, minimal number of animals used. It could be summarized in text format. But in addition to that, I also want to state that we understand there's confusion around this, and the agency is currently working on drafting some kind of language to address this to make this a little bit more clear. So look for communication in the future about this. I also, at this time, I'm also going to state, because we've seen these questions before as well, that regarding draft and interim study reports, SEND is also required. Okay. So another question that I saw multiple times with a little bit of differences, is surrounding the cardiovascular and respiratory safety pharmacology studies and the technical rejection criteria. So let me state, to be clear, that when the technical rejection criteria is activated, and industry will receive 90 days notice when it will become activated, that at this time, we're only going to focus in on modules 4231, 32, and 34. We are not, when it becomes activated initially, going to focus on the safety pharmacology studies in module 4213. So you would not, at this time, or when the technical rejection criteria is activated, you would not need a simplified TS for cardiovascular or respiratory safety pharmacology studies. If you do send with these studies, that would be okay too. So nothing is preventing you from doing that. The implementation date for commercial INDs won't be until March of next year. So again, when the technical rejection criteria is activated, it will not immediately apply to these safety pharmacology studies. It will in the future, and we will let you know through the technical rejection criteria and also the Study Data TCG. So look for that information when we're ready to do that. And there was one additional question that came in that I just wanted to clarify. What is a non-clinical safety report versus a toxicology report? So by non-clinical safety reports, I mean those where they're submitted to the agency. They're usually a short text-based document to inform the agency that in a non-clinical study, there is some type of significant adverse event that happened in the non-clinical study, such as all of the high-dose animals died for some for some reason. So that's what I mean by non-clinical safety report. So I'm going to pass this over for additional questions to Helena.
Hey guys, we're collating your questions live as we speak, so we're a little more informal here. We've gotten a couple questions about how to handle deviations in the DV SDTM domain and what constitutes a subject level protocol deviation versus a site level deviation. I know we introduced some novel content into the Study Data Technical Conformance Guide back in October 2018, and we continue to get some questions about the specifics of implementing this. So instead of going into specifics here, I'm going to ask you guys if you have examples of things that you need to model into a DV domain, or you're not sure how to reach out to us through the eData inbox with specific examples or specific questions about variables or how, or even just the actual deviation, and see how best to model that. There's not a one-size-fits-all answer, but we hear you. You guys have questions. We are working to clarify that section of the TCG. So thank you for that, and thank you for the opportunity to clarify that. Next question. We get this question a lot, and I've seen this a couple times even here today. That is, and I'm just going to address this question, but at a higher level, and it is what to do when the instructions given in the Study Data Technical Conformance Guide appear to conflict with what may be in the CDISC standard documentation somewhere, whether it's in a model or an implementation guide or listed in a conformance rule. And I just want to say that as an agency, we work very closely with CDISC. It is always our intention to follow the implementation guide or model or conformance rules wherever it meets our business needs. And whenever we deviate from that, it is with very strong hesitation and usually with with good cause, and also usually with collaboration with our CDISC colleagues. So if you ever have an interpretation issue with what you read in the Technical Conformance Guide that appears to contradict what is in a CDISC document, please feel free to reach out to us in any of the eData inboxes. We will get you an answer for that. If you have concern about that, you're always free for an impending application. You guys can always reach out to your divisions for that clarity. And if you see downstream issues and you're early in your development phase, you can bring these issues up in your study data standardization plan, your sdSP, and you can highlight your concerns there and get the conversations going on that topic pretty early. We have a ton of questions from you guys today about when these are going, when the technical rejection criteria are going to be turned on, and we will communicate to you. We will give industry 90 days notice on when that will be turned on. We don't have a date. We can't give you a date, and they are not turned on yet. Do we have any other questions? Heather? Stephanie?
Yeah, to branch off of Helena's last answer, FDA's expectation is that we would give 90 days notice on the ECTD webpage prior to the TRC being implemented, and our expectation is we would give that 90 days notice by early 2020. So there have been a couple questions submitted about there's one question of if we are submitting a revised study report in an IND amendment with no new tables for a study whereas simplified ts.xpt was already submitted, do we need to submit a simplified ts.xpt again? And from the TRC perspective, if the TRC expected information was submitted for this study in the previous TS, so your study start date, all those things that are laid out in the TRC examples and the TCG, then no, it would not have to be submitted again from the TRC perspective. And several people have asked about the SPREF ID alternate matching, if that applies only to non-clinical, and the use of the SPREF ID parameter to match the STF study ID can be used for clinical and non-clinical studies. Several people have asked about specific scenarios for their submission, their application type with studies starting with a specific date, and what the TS requirement expectation is. And I would recommend checking that expectation chart in either the self-check worksheet or the TRC documentation, where all of that information is laid out. And then if you have any specific questions about your specific scenario, you can email eData and they can help you.
So we have a bunch of questions asking specifically about CDER And we don't have any of our CBER colleagues today with us. And I don't want to answer on behalf of CBER, even though the answers are probably obvious. But if you guys have questions, you can submit directly to CBER at the CBER-edata@fda.hhs.gov about send requirements, about trial summary requirements, about SDTM requirements. They're always glad to answer your questions.
Okay, this is Stephanie again. I just have a couple more questions I want to answer. So one of the questions was, is a defined file required when submitting a simplified ts.xpt? And the answer is no. If you're submitting a simplified ts.xpt, we only need that minimal amount of information that I stated, and you do not need a defined file. And there was a question, I had made the statement during my presentation, when in doubt, to use the simplified ts.xpt. So I just want to clarify. So that was regarding the example with the file tag. So, for example, if you had in the example, a protocol that you were submitting, and you use that file tag, and you're comfortable using that file tag, that's great. That will pass the technical rejection criteria. But if you're a little bit unsure, and you use preclinical study report, then that's what I mean by if you're not sure about the file tag and you're using one of those three, just simply put in a simplified TS file, and that will be sufficient to get you through the technical rejection criteria. And then just to reiterate, I've seen a couple of questions, just to be clear, when the technical rejection criteria is activated, for non-clinical studies, we're only going to be focused in on modules 4231, single dose toxicity, 4232, repeat dose toxicity, and 4234, or carcinogenicity, when it becomes active.
So we received a question of, is the automated comparison of STF study ID with the TS file study ID and SP ref ID a case-sensitive comparison? And for the validation, I believe the comparison is not case-sensitive, but you can always email eData to check. And we also received the question of, is the STF an ECTD thing? And the STF.xml is part of the ECTD standard. You can find out more on the FDA ECTD webpage, where they have specifications on the STF as well as the full ECTD standard. And that is all the questions that we have time for today.
And thank you to our speakers for your very informative and timely talk, and also for responding to the questions that came in. A few closing reminders. This activity is eligible for continuing education by SOCRA, RAPS, SQA, and ACRP. Please refer to our website at fda.gov/CDER-SBIA for more details. You'll be able to obtain the attendance certificate only upon completion of the survey, which will remain open for 2 weeks. Let us know your comments and feedback via the survey. This will provide us with ideas for future improvements. If your question was not answered, please resend to CDER-edata@fda.hhs.gov. On behalf of CDER Small Business and Industry Assistance, we hope you enjoyed today's presentation and found it helpful. We look forward to your presence at future webinars, which will be advertised on our website at fda.gov/CDER. v4.4/CDER SBIA webinars. Thank you.